You ever come across that one scene in a movie that seems to perfectly represent that movie's quality? Maybe it doesn't have everything to do with every single plot point, but there's just something about it that encapsulates the level of writing you're dealing with. I think the therapist scene from Artemis Fowl is one such scene. It is a perfect representation of just how awful the movie is, both as an adaptation and a standalone movie. Hell, the very first shot of the scene is about as subtle as a brick to the face. All these psychology textbooks laid out on the desk are clearly meant to signal to the audience, "We're in a psychologist's office!" and not because they would naturally be there. I mean, really think about it. Have you ever known any therapist to lay out his textbooks like this rather than, store them on a bookshelf? And you can't even say that these are for the students to read or something because there's only one copy of each book and they're clearly facing toward where the doctor would be if he were sitting behind his desk. You could maybe make the argument that them being laid out on his desk is meant to imply that he was reading them before his session with Artemis, but if that were the case, why are none of them open? Why are they so neatly arranged so that all of their titles are clearly visible? And, slight tangent, but why the is his name plaque facing toward the camera rather than facing away from the desk so that people can read it when they come in? That's literally the whole point of having a plaque to begin with. This shot is clearly arranged for the audience's benefit rather than because it's something that would naturally be in the scene. It's such a clumsy way to establish location that, quite frankly, is made completely unnecessary when the shot pans up to reveal Artemis and the therapist sitting across from one another.
Now, Artemis, let's talk, shall we?
Certainly, sir.
Ah, I can see you're admiring my chair.
Okay, I know we're only a few seconds into the scene, but we've already got problems. First off, Artemis shouldn't be referring to the therapist as Sir, he should be addressing him as Doctor.
Now, Master Fowl, let's talk, shall we? Certainly, Doctor.
It may only be one word, but calling him Doctor is meant to be the first hint at what Artemis tends to value, which serves as valuable insight into his character that the writers have just thrown out the window. Sir is a more general and respectful honorific, whereas Doctor is a more formal and specific title. Artemis is a lot of things, but he is not respectful, not at this point in the story. In fact, his being disrespectful to everyone in his life is kind of the whole point of the scene, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Second, I'm not a fan of the therapist referring to him as Artemis as opposed to Master Fowl like in the book. In the book, Artemis has already gone through several therapists, and each one has retired because they got sick of putting up with Artemis's BS. Having the therapist start off by calling him Master Fowl is supposed to be a means of establishing a sense of dominance over the conversation and letting him know that he's not going to play ball. Now, as far as I'm aware, that's not a factor at play in the movie, so you could argue that it makes sense for the therapist to not feel the need to do that, which is fine I suppose, but it's the first real hint towards how confusing this scene is tonally. Third, and most importantly, Artemis does take an interest in the therapist's chair in the book, but he's the one who brings it into the conversation, not the therapist.
Certainly, Doctor. Let's talk about your chair. Victorian?
The casual observer might not think this change very significant, but communicating information to your audience is a much more delicate art than you might think. The things that are being said aren't the only element you have to be aware of when writing. What's being said, who's saying it, how they're saying it, why they're saying it, who they're saying it to, it all conveys information to the audience and informs the characters, albeit in subtle and indirect ways. You can't just change who's saying what willy-nilly and expect to get similar results. Having Artemis identify the therapist's chair as a Victorian-era piece shows that he's unusually well-educated and intelligent for his age, and the reason he brings up the chair in the first place is because he's attempting to attack the therapist's self-esteem. He's correctly deduced that the chair is something that the therapist treasures, and he intends to undermine the therapist's confidence by informing him that his precious family heirloom is a fake.
Something of a family heirloom. My grandfather acquired it at an auction at Sotheby's. Apparently it once stood in the palace, the Queen's favourite. A taut smile stretched Artemis's lips, perhaps a centimetre. Really, Doctor? They don't generally allow fakes in the palace. Fake? I assure you, Master Fowl, this is completely authentic. It's clever, I grant you, but look here. Poe's gaze followed the youth's finger. Those furniture tacks. See the criss-cross pattern on the head? Machine-tooled. 1920 at the earliest. Your grandfather was duped. But what matter? A chair's a chair. A possession of no importance, eh, Doctor?
Having Artemis demonstrate how he knows it's a fake also further solidifies his intellect and shows that he's not just well educated, he has first-hand experience, which makes sense when you remember that he's forged several pieces of art himself, according to the psychological assessment in the opening pages of the book. And no screenwriters, having the therapist say, "as I'm sure you know," is not an appropriate substitute.
William and Mary period. 1689 to 1702, as I'm sure you know.
It's not only less conversational and more expository, but for all we know, Artemis didn't know what era the chair was from at all, and the therapist just gave him the answer. By not having Artemis bring up the chair directly, or correctly identify the era it's supposedly from, not only does the conversation not flow as naturally, not only is the subtext thoroughly disrupted, but the writers have also stripped a bit of agency from Artemis's character. He's no longer directing the conversation in this moment, and his character is that much less compelling for it. Now, those of you who've had the misfortune of actually watching this movie may point out that Artemis does in fact identify the chair as a fake later in the scene, which is perfectly true, but not only does that slight change in context serve to make Artemis's character less compelling, it also doesn't make any sense. See, Book Artemis considers the therapy a waste of time, and is subtly trying to frustrate the therapist into quitting, a la Good Will Hunting.
Artemis sighed deeply, smoothing his dark hair back from a wide, pale brow. When would people learn that a mind such as his could not be dissected? He himself had read more psychology textbooks than the counselor, but he had even contributed an article to the Psychologist's Journal under the pseudonym Dr. F. Roy Dean Schlick.
The only reason he's bothering to attend the therapy in the first place is because his mother was concerned about his mental health after essentially being on his own for the past 2 years, and arranged the sessions with the school's counselor. Which, incidentally, is context that is completely absent in the movie, but I'll get to that travesty later. Even if we assume that movie Artemis holds a similar opinion on the therapy, the fact that he doesn't bring up the chair being a fake right away means that he's obviously not trying to get the therapist to quit like in the book. Which begs the question, what's the point of bringing up the chair being a fake in this version? The movie tells us that he's lashing out because of the burden of his family name or some shit. But if you look at what the therapist actually said before Artemis brings the chair back up, you'll notice that he didn't say anything inflammatory or provocative or even insulting. All he asked was whether his father's mysterious absences were the reason Artemis behaves the way he does, which literally gives us nothing to go on. We have no frame of reference for how Artemis has behaved before this scene, or why he takes such offense at the therapist bringing up his father's mysterious absences, so there's no clear reason for Artemis being such a dick about the therapist's family heirloom anymore. Instead of subtly trying to irritate the therapist into quitting, he's now trying to get back at him for maybe being disrespectful. They took a cunning and manipulative power play and turned it into a childish barb meant only to hurt the therapist's feelings.
Pathetic.
Now, in the name of fairness, I'd like to highlight one of the few points of praise I have for this scene before I move on. When the therapist mentions that the chair used to be the Queen's favorite, the camera cuts away to Artemis's face and we see him smirk slightly at these words. Not only does this happen in the book, but it's also a really subtle detail indicating that Artemis has caught on to something that the therapist hasn't. It's a really nice bit of character work, and I think Frida Shaw deserves kudos for that bit of acting. He needs all the kudos he can get, seeing as the rest of his acting is more wooden than Pinocchio.
Now, Artemis, there is a problem.
The problem is that I know the textbook reply to any question you may choose to ask.
The problem is that you don't respect anyone enough to treat them as an equal.
So, I wasn't sure if my book knowledge was tainting my perception of this exchange, so I showed this to a couple of buddies of mine, and turns out my initial assessment of this part was bang on. The dialogue here does not sound natural at all, and it's not just because of Shaw's wooden performance. There are several cut lines from the book that aren't included here, and the dialogue doesn't flow properly without them.
But what matter? A chair's a chair. A possession of no importance, eh, Doctor? Yes, Artemis. Very clever. Just as your file says, playing your little games. Now, shall we get back to you? There is a problem here, Doctor. Really? And what might that be? The problem is that I know the textbook replies to any question you care to ask. Dr. Poe jotted in his notepad for a full minute. We do have a problem, Artemis, but that's not it. Artemis almost smiled. No doubt the doctor would treat him to another predictable theory. The problem is that you don't respect anyone enough to treat them as an equal.
They got all the most important bits in there, but they don't have any of the connecting tissue that holds it all together. It's like building a brick wall without the mortar. And frankly, I'm not convinced that they understood why those lines were so important in the first place. Artemis saying that he knows all the textbook replies is supposed to be a flex. If he knows all of the textbook replies, he can theoretically convince the therapist that he's suffering from any number of psychological conditions. He's trying to convince the therapist that the session is pointless. But as I mentioned earlier, I'm not convinced that Artemis wants to get him to quit in this version. He does walk out at the end of the scene, which might suggest that, but he did so after the therapist asked him a stupid and frankly pointless question about whether Artemis is feeling some sort of burden from his family name. For all we know, he could have left because he thought that that stupid question was a stupid question.
The problem is that you don't respect anyone enough to treat them as an equal.
That's ridiculous. I hold several people in the very highest esteem.
Really? Who, for example?
Albert Einstein. His theories were usually correct.
How about someone you actually know?
Okay, this is a bit better. The acting is still off, but it's a faithful exchange from the book that demonstrates the therapist's point and shows better than anything else what Artemis values, or at least what he's supposed to value. Artemis's admiration for Einstein and his tendency to be correct a lot of the time clearly demonstrates a significant admiration for intellect, which makes a lot of sense given that he himself is meant to be extraordinarily smart. It also touches back on my earlier point about Artemis addressing the therapist as doctor rather than sir. In the book, Artemis would generally address people by their titles as a means of recognizing their achievements, even if he didn't respect them personally. The therapist must have proven himself worthy of being referred to as doctor, given that he has the license to practice, so Artemis addressing him as such serves as an acknowledgement of that fact while still maintaining a degree of distance, detachment, and even superiority. You see it all the time when he's addressing characters like Holly or Commander Root. I do sort of miss Artemis also mentioning his respect for Archimedes, but considering this is a film adaptation and adaptations generally need to trim their stories to make them coherent, I think I can give that a pass. What I can't abide though is why the therapist is pointing this out to Artemis in the first place. The way this line is framed in the movie, it seems like the writers are trying to establish Artemis's primary character flaw. But Artemis's character arc, such as it is, has nothing to do with him learning to respect people in this movie. To be perfectly frank, the jury is still out on what exactly Artemis's arc is even supposed to be, but if I had to guess, I'd say it has something to do with his final line to Opal about being a criminal mastermind.
I'm Artemis Fowl. And I'm a criminal mastermind.
Now, riddle me this, Batman! What the f does Artemis being a criminal mastermind have to do with respecting others?
Nothing! Absolutely nothing!
The closest the movie ever gets to it being relevant is when he forms an alliance with Holly because he needs her help and he trusts her? God, this movie's confusing. But you can't even say that that played a significant role in his development because the movie gives no clear reason for why he suddenly trusts Holly to help him. I'm not even sure why he thought he needed her help, since the scene where he lets her out of her cell happens before he even knows the leper sending the troll into the house. Bottom line, there's no longer any reason for the therapist to point out Artemis's inability to respect people, so this exchange between them is, once again, entirely pointless. Well done, movie.
Stupid! You're so stupid!
How about someone you actually know?
You seem to have all the answers, Doctor. Why don't you tell me?
What? Where the hell did that come from? Okay, I know for a fact that it's not just my book knowledge infecting my judgment this time. Artemis's response is a complete non sequitur to the therapist's line. Here's how it's supposed to sound in the book.
What about someone that you actually know? Artemis thought hard. No one came to mind. What? No examples? Artemis shrugged. You seem to have all the answers, Dr. Poe. Why don't you tell me?
Without that line from the therapist prompting him again for any real-life examples, Artemis's line about him having all the answers makes no sense. And I'm sorry I keep harping on this, but it also throws out the whole power dynamic between them in the book. The therapist asking Artemis if he can't come up with any examples is meant to be a celebration of sorts. He's outsmarted Artemis in this moment, and he's basically trying to rub it in. Even if we assume that there isn't meant to be a power dynamic between them in the movie, which to be fair I have been throughout this entire analysis, that just begs the question. Why would they even bother having Artemis sarcastically tell the therapist to tell him all the answers? Why not switch the line out for something else so that the changes in the dialogue flow better?
You seem to have all the answers, Doctor. Why don't you tell me?
Well, where should we start?
You already started. You started back when you two were discussing the chair. What the fuck?
That's my biography, I presume.
It is. It explains quite a lot.
Okay, no. Fuck off, movie. There's no way I'm buying that Artemis has a biography. In the book, he already had an extensive career under his belt, in addition to his significant intellectual triumphs, which were honestly downplayed in the movie. And that's not even mentioning the fact that Artemis comes from a long line of criminals, so it would make sense for him to already have books written about him. The Fowl family in this version has no such reputation, at least not yet. And while Mulch's narration during the opening of the movie tells us that he has several noteworthy achievements to his name already, Artemis is only 12. I can buy that he'd have news articles and interviews done about him, but a biography? Get the f*** out of my office. Also, they f***ed up the dialogue again. The therapist is supposed to bring up the biography in response to Artemis telling him to provide all the answers.
You seem to have all the answers, Dr. Poe. Why don't you tell me? Poe opened a window on his laptop. Extraordinary. Every time I read this, my biography, I presume. Yes, it explains a lot.
It's supposed to be a segue into establishing Artemis's relationships at this point, and the movie ruins that by having Artemis suggest the biography as the place to start, rather than the therapist. Hell, even ignoring the adaptation argument for a moment, why wouldn't the therapist bring up the biography as a place to start to begin with? Artemis invited him to provide the answers, and a biography would presumably be a good place to start.
It explains quite a lot.
Such as?
Well, firstly, there's your dear mother, who was a wonderful woman, in my opinion, and taken from us far too soon.
Oh yeah! That's right! His mom's dead in this version! Because Disney can't write children to save their lives if they don't have at least one dead parent. Good job f***ing up Artemis's plan to escape the time field, guys!
Applaud, everyone! Applaud sarcastically. No, that sounds too sincere. Slow clap. There we go. Nice and condescending.
Also, that line is overwritten as f***. You didn't need that bit where he says she was taken from us far too soon. Just the was a wonderful woman bit would have been enough.
But who sadly had absolutely no control over your behavior.
What behavior? Artemis isn't a criminal in this version. Not yet anyway. There are only a few achievements to his name so far, and none of them are illegal. This line would make more sense if they kept the bit where Artemis reveals that the chair is a fake where it originally was in the book. That way we'd have some frame of reference for what the therapist is referring to when he talks about Artemis's behavior. Without that frame of reference, this Artemis is a troubled kid shtick comes out of nowhere, makes absolutely no sense, and never becomes relevant again throughout the rest of the movie. If anything, the movie directly contradicts this notion when it shows him having a normal, healthy relationship with his father. Why the f*** would you keep that line about his mom having no control over his behavior if you were going to kill her off before the story even got started?
Then, of course, there's your father and his mysterious absences from home.
This is a sensitive area, Doctor.
Okay, that line is out of character for both book Artemis and movie Artemis. In the book, Artemis said that line in an effort to mislead the therapist and to play a prank on him for disrespecting his father.
Finally, there's your father. According to this, he wasn't much of a role model even when he was alive. Your file is mistaken, Doctor. My father is alive. Missing, perhaps, but alive. Really? I was under the impression that he'd been missing for almost 2 years. Why, the courts have declared him legally dead. I don't care what the courts say or the Red Cross. He's alive, and I will find him. But even if your father were to return, what then? Will you follow in his footsteps? Will you be a criminal like him? Perhaps you already are. My father is no criminal. He was moving all our assets into legitimate enterprises. The Murmansk venture was completely above board. You're avoiding the question, Artemis. But Artemis had had enough of this line of questioning. Time to play a little game. Why, Doctor, said Artemis, shocked. This is a sensitive area. For all you know, I could be suffering from depression.
Now, you don't get a precise read on how Artemis delivers this line in the book, because, it's a book. But you can tell from the prose that he's at least trying to sound serious so he can trick the therapist. Shaw delivers the line like he's planning to arrange for the therapist's prized racehorse's head to end up in his bed sheets. He's never like that anywhere else in the movie, as far as I can tell. And that's not even mentioning the fact that the line goes absolutely nowhere. Seriously, the therapist doesn't even acknowledge it. Compare that to the book, where the line has a proper lead into the subject of depression so that Artemis can convince the therapist that they've reached a breakthrough.
For all you know, I could be suffering from depression. I suppose you could. Is that the case? Artemis dropped his face into his hands. It's my mother, Doctor. Your mother? Prompted Poe.
Only to deliver a backhanded remark about the therapy being the source of his depression episode.
She forces me to endure this ridiculous therapy when the school's so-called counselors are little better than misguided do-gooders with degrees.
Now, none of this is to say that Artemis wouldn't threaten someone. In fact, he threatens to have Butler kill an informant at least once in the opening chapter of the first book. Arguably twice depending on how you interpret certain lines in the scene in question. The difference, though, is that that person was part of the criminal underworld. He wasn't an upstanding civilian like the therapist is. Even if Artemis were inclined to be so angry with the therapist to the point of threatening his life, he'd know better than to actually do it and risk criminal charges.
But do you think that's why you are as you are?
No. And by the way, I didn't know they allowed fakes at the palace.
Fake?
See what I mean about that line having no clear purpose anymore? It's a complete non sequitur now. Also, I have to object to the slight change in wording here. Artemis doesn't say that he didn't know that they allowed fakes in the palace. He says,
I don't generally allow fakes in the palace.
A slight change perhaps, but as I hope I've made clear, slight changes can have significant meaning. One is something you say when you're learning a new piece of information, while the other is a definitive statement of fact. The movie's version of the line is clearly meant to be sarcastic, but the book's version does a much better job establishing Artemis's cocky and condescending attitude. And while I can't say sarcasm is necessarily out of character for Artemis, he's much more prone to making people feel inferior by lecturing them, rather than resorting to sarcasm.
It's clever, I'll give you that. But look at these furniture tacks. Crisscross pattern on the head. Machine tooled. Makes it 1890s at the earliest. Your grandfather was duped.
Oh, come on! You didn't even have him point at the furniture tacks! I know I'm nitpicking, but the dialogue in this scene clearly indicates that he should be pointing at the tacks. The book specifically mentions that Artemis indicates where the therapist should look when he's explaining how he knows the chair is a fake. The scene is making such an effort to be a recognizable recreation of the source material, and you can't even be bothered to have Artemis point at the evidence?
Artemis, you're lashing out at me, but I think I know what this is really about.
Gee, thanks for pointing out that he was lashing out at you. I never would have guessed that that was what he was trying to do when he started mocking you about your bogus family heirloom.
Is it because of the burden of your father's name?
What sort of a stupid question is that?
Bro, what the f does his father's name have to do with him lashing out at you? He only started lashing out at you when you asked him if his father's absences were what made him act in the way that he did. Which still gives us nothing to go on, by the way. What does his father's name have to do with his father's mysterious absences from home?
No. It's because I'm forced to endure this ridiculous therapy.
Artemis? Look, just who do you think you are?
And in keeping with this scene's losing streak, they've f***ed up the reason why Artemis left the session early. In the book, Artemis was called away by Butler because he'd received a message regarding the fate of his father.
Artemis was spared further analysis by the vibration of his mobile phone. The boy retrieved it from his pocket. Yes? Butler's voice came through the speaker. Artemis, it's me. Obviously. I'm in the middle of something here. We've had a message. Yes? From where? I don't know exactly, but it concerns the Fowl Star. A jolt flew along Artemis's spine. Where are you? The main gate? Good man, I'm on my way.
Since the Fowl Star isn't a plot point in the movie, they needed another reason for him to leave the session, but the choice they went with makes him look petulant and immature, which is not only terrible from an adaptation angle, it seriously harms his credibility when he's trying to be cool and intimidating later in the movie. This whole scene feels like the writers were juggling at least half a dozen different versions of the script without any coherent idea of what they wanted it to be. It honestly wouldn't surprise me if that were the case, considering how long the movie spent in development hell before shooting finally began. The changes to the dialogue are completely unnecessary and just bloat the whole scene's pace. The tone is all over the place, the subtext is more confused than a cow in a tornado, and for the life of me, I cannot figure out what the writers were trying to establish about Artemis's character with this scene. And remember, this is the very first interaction we see with Artemis, which means they were trying to establish who he is as a character here. The fact that you can't tell what they were going for with this interaction could not be a more damning testament to their incompetence. Which brings me to what is easily the saddest part about this whole scene, what is easily the biggest problem with it. The fact that this scene is in this movie in the first place. See, for whatever reason, the creators of this movie decided to incorporate elements from other books in the series when adapting it, rather than focusing on the first book and only the first book. The therapist scene is one such element. It never happened in the first book. It was the opening chapter of the second book in this series, The Arctic Incident. The whole point of the therapist scene in the book, aside from reintroducing the character, was to establish Artemis's character arc throughout the rest of the story. Remember how the therapist asserted that Artemis's problem was that he didn't respect anyone in his life enough to treat them as an equal, and how I thought that that was the movie trying to set up some sort of core character flaw? Well, part of the reason I thought that was because that was exactly what the line was in the book. Artemis struggles to prove the therapist wrong when he's unable to come up with any examples, and the story then bookends this moment when Artemis goes to another session during the epilogue. The therapist decides to revisit the issue of respect and asks Artemis if he can think of any examples this time.
You know, we still haven't resolved that last issue. Which issue is that, Doctor? The one we touched on at our last session, about respect. Ah, that issue. Poe steepled his fingers. I want you to pretend I'm as smart as you are, and give me an honest answer. Have you found anyone worthy of your respect? Artemis smiled back. Yes, he said. I believe I have.
The movie is attempting to co-opt this scene to serve a similar function, but it strips the scene of its original meaning in the process, failing to add anything new that actually serves the story, and doesn't even bother to understand any of its character work or narrative value. And that, right there, is the perfect summary of this scene and of this movie. It is the worst kind of story and the worst kind of adaptation. The kind of story that has no coherent narrative or characters, and the kind of adaptation that is just close enough to the original work to be recognizable, without any of the substance that made it great in the first place.